Mom taught us one rule: always check for your shadow. Every few hours, the three of us, Mom, Curly, and me, would do a shadow check. It was as second nature as taking a sip of water. "Shadow check," my mom would call, and we'd both look down, checking that our shadow was still there. I thought everyone did this. We were homeschooled, so no one really told me otherwise. And my one friend down the block, Samantha, was a little strange herself, so she never seemed to notice. But then Mom got a job, and Curly and I went to school, and that's when everything collapsed. "What are you doing?" Paige asked me, as we stood outside for recess one cool fall afternoon. "Shadow check," I replied. "Duh." "Shadow check?" she asked, confused. "What's that?" I squinted at her. "You don't know what a shadow check is?" It was like she'd told me she didn't know how to brush her teeth. I explained, slowly in simple terms, like I was talking to a baby. "You look at the ground to check your shadow is still there." She obediently looked at the ground. There it is. Then she raised her arms out in front of her and linked them, making her shadow look like the letter P. "Look, it's like P for Paige." In no time at all, half of the class was doing it. We'd bound out for recess, and someone would shout, "Shadow check." The kids would contort their bodies into weird shapes to make their shadows look like elephants or cats or letters, and we'd try to guess what they were. That went on nicely for about 3 days. Then, horror struck. On Thursday afternoon, it was overcast. "Shadow check," Thomas shouted. I diligently looked down and saw my shadow, but when I looked up, I realized nobody else had a shadow. For a second, I wanted to panic and scream and run, but then I took a deep breath and did exactly what my mom taught me. I grabbed Paige first. "Hey," she protested. But I didn't listen. I held on with a vice grip and started pulling her back towards the school. When the shadow goes away, hide in darkness for a day. The mantra echoed in my head. The school had a basement. I'd heard the teachers mention it. The basement would be safe. All we had to do was stay there until the morning. "Let go of me," Paige screeched, finally yanking her wrist out of my grasp. "What's wrong with you?" "What's wrong with you?" I screamed back. "We have to hide." The kids weren't smiling anymore. They were staring at me, backing away, like I was a rabid animal. "We have to hide," I screamed again. "All the shadows are gone." I grabbed at Paige again, but she dodged this time. I lost my footing and fell onto the asphalt. Pain stung my knees. I looked up at my classmates. Why aren't they hiding? "What are you doing? Run!" I screamed. That's when a teacher helped me up and took me right to the principal's office. I should have explained more clearly, my mother told that night as she tucked me in. The shadow thing is only for us. It's okay if other people don't have shadows. Why? Sadness flashed across her face for a second. Then she shook her head. That's just the way it is. No one talked to me at recess anymore, not even Paige. I sat alone all the time. I noticed now that there were many days, and some classrooms even, when people didn't have shadows. I always did, but they didn't. Months passed, and eventually, kids forgot about the incident. That's what kids do. Forget. Sometimes I wish forgiving and forgetting came easier to adults. Paige would run up to me at recess, and we'd play hopscotch. She never brought up the fact that even on an overcast day, my shadow still danced across the chalk lines, mirroring my own movements. Except sometimes, they were the slightest bit out of sync, like my shadow was moving on a split-second delay. As I got older, however, things got more complicated. In 7th grade science, the teacher taught us about the sun and optics and light, prisms and rainbows and the cones and rods in our eyes. And she mentioned that our shadow was just the absence of light, that our bodies were blocking out the sun, or the overhead fluorescent lights. It didn't make sense to me then that my shadow, or anyone else's, would be able to disappear. If the lighting didn't change and I didn't move, how could a shadow suddenly disappear? Curly was now old enough to insist we called her by her real name, but she was still too young to understand the argument I had with my mom that night. "It's not possible," I shouted as she worked on her coloring book upstairs. "You're lying to me." "I'm not lying to you," my mother pleaded. "Yes, you are." I ran across the living room to get in my mom's face, walked right past the ornate glass lamp that stood on the end table. My mom's eyes widened. She looked at the ground, and that's when I realized my shadow was gone. The lamp was behind me. My shadow should have been on the floor in front of me, but it wasn't. "Run," she whispered. When I didn't move, she began to shout, "Go to Curly, go!" I hesitated for half a second, then I sprinted for the stairs. "Turn off the light," she shouted after me. I darted in and closed to the door. Then I bent down and yanked out the plug to the lamp. "Hey," Curly said, "I'm coloring." "Shh," I whispered. "What?" My shadow disappeared. Curly was too young to remember the day her shadow disappeared. She'd only been a year old. Mom had scooped her out of the playpen, grabbed me by the hand, and took the three of us into the basement. We spent the night down there, in total darkness, eating canned beans and sleeping on old comforters laid out on the cement floor. But she knew that it was bad. She scrambled over to her bed and pulled the covers over her head. I stood in the center of the room, listening for Mom's footsteps. They never came. Is she staying down there? But we had so many lights on down there. It would be safer to just run to us. I crept towards the door, my heart pounding, slipping over the Barbies Curly had all over the floor. "Mom," I called out through the door. Nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. I could see the stairs, the light spilling out from the living room. But everything was silent. Maybe she went into the basement. Maybe. A shadow appeared, cast across the wall. No! She's still down there? But no, that couldn't be my mom's shadow. It was too short. And even though the edges were blurry, the shadow sort of looked like it had a ponytail. Not a short hair and a pixie cut, like my mom. That's not Mom. That's me. The blurry edges sharpened. And then the figure, the shadow, came into view. My ponytail, my upturned nose, my knocked knees. The thing crouched down and pulled at something, yanking it, moving completely independent of me. A dragging sound. My mother's feet came into view, still and lifeless. I gasped. My hand clapped to my mouth, but it was too late. The shadow froze, turned to stare directly at me. And then with huge loping strides, it started up the stairs. I slammed the door shut, clicked the lock. Then I jumped under the covers with Curly, my entire body trembling. The police never found Mom's body. She was eventually declared legally dead. Curly and I were sent away to live with our grandparents. They didn't seem to know anything about the shadow. They never asked us to do shadow checks. The only remark in 10 years was my grandma, on a particularly cloudy day, remarking how strange it was that I cast a perfect shadow on the sidewalk in front of us. I watched it as I walked, and noticed its movements weren't perfectly in sync with my own. As the years went by, and my shadow didn't disappear again, I started to get complacent. I checked for it less and less frequently. I started to lead a normal life, getting hired as a real estate agent. Curly, now going by her name Rebecca, is 19 and in college. I even started to persuade myself that my shadow didn't kill her, that my mom ran away after our fight, and my memory of the shadow was my way of coping with it. Because it was harder to accept my mom had abandoned us than it was to accept an evil shadow had killed her. That's what I told myself, until tonight. As I sat down on my computer to finish writing a house listing, I noticed there was no shadow of my fingers on the keyboard, no shadow on the linoleum under the desk. I ran to turn off all the lights, but I don't think I was fast enough, because when I ran to close the blinds, to block out the light from the street lamp below, I saw my shadow, walking across the dark street, disappearing into the night. So please, I beg you, if you see any strange shadows in your home or outside, something you don't think is cast by the lights, by the objects in your home, something that looks different, hide. Somewhere pitch dark, where no shadows can be cast until morning. An anomaly is defined as anything that deviates from the expected, normal, or standard. This is quite a wide definition. An ant being slightly stronger than most others of its species is an anomaly. But so is something that breaks our perception of reality. Something that goes against everything we've ever known, bringing the nature of existence into question, is an anomaly. Something to be studied. When it gets swept away, unexplained, however much the anomaly has affected your life, you begin to feel a lot like that ant. Insignificant. My sister is an anomaly now. It started with a simple complaint about her hand feeling strange, a tingling sensation. The doctors almost flat out refused to do anything. I want to be angry, but then I remember telling her my own thoughts. It's nothing. Everyone gets weird feelings. It'll pass. It's what everyone told her. I suppose we thought we were reassuring her. Then the next symptom began. We awoke to her screaming over and over. My hand is drooping. My hand is drooping. Without any context, what does that even mean? She knew exactly what it meant. She was the only one living this nightmare. Nobody could quite understand what she felt. I burst into her room seconds before our parents did the same. There she knelt, on her bed, with the fingers of her right hand about twice as long as usual. I can feel them, she cried. They're trying to continue. My mother flicked the switch, perhaps hoping that our eyes deceived us in the dark. The middle of the night, in a very dim light, it seems to teeter right on the edge of reality. It's the perfect condition to conjure up an illusion of the mind. Yet this, right here, was as real as you. Her hand was stretched. My mother immediately dialed the emergency services, whilst my father went into comfort mode. Hey, it's all right. Are you feeling okay? My sister sat for a moment, staring at her hand. Her breathing remained constantly heavy. In the background, I could hear my mother on the phone, although I wasn't paying much attention. Yes, twice as long. She was asleep. No, I don't know how. I feel... She paused, perhaps focusing on the feeling, deciding whether or not she felt okay. How would she even describe okay in this moment? Long. My father and I glanced at each other for a moment. Was that meant to be a joke? I smiled awkwardly. What does that mean? She got up from her bed, making it slowly apparent to all of us that she was taller. Not by much, maybe an inch or two, but in the context of human height overnight, that's a lot. The room fell silent. I think I could make out the operator on the other side of the phone, trying to see if my mother was still there. Physically she was, but mentally, I think she was just worried for her daughter. What's happening to me? Her voice broke slightly. It broke all of us along with it. To sound so dazed and lost about your own self is heartbreaking. It was the last time I saw her with any description of human emotion. She lunged towards my mother in the doorway, not to hurt her, just to leave the room. Although, with all the urgency she had in her movement, I don't believe she would have cared if she had hurt anybody on the way out. We all called out for her, but she didn't turn back around. She didn't speak. She just ran through the house. Leaving the light of her room, she blended into the shadows. I don't know if my mind deceived me, but I swear I saw her hit her head on the ceiling multiple times, as if she was growing further, Each time she did, she grunted with pain, as if using a voice that was not her own. Each of us only seeing her from the corner of our eyes had managed to lose her in our own home. My father searched around upstairs, whilst my mother, still on the phone, started wandering the street outside. Catching a glimpse of something out the back window of the kitchen, I stepped outside. I was afraid of what I might be walking into, what nightmare could be waiting for me. I decided that whatever it was, I owe it to my sister to join her in this. Slowly, I made my way towards the movement. She had wrapped herself around a tree in the garden, one we used to climb as kids. She spoke something that I could only just make out over the sound of my own heart pounding. Everything is long. Her voice, raspy and weak, frightened me. Her black hair, usually down to her shoulders, now found its way down to the floor. I couldn't see her fully in the night, but the moonlight allowed me to see her vague shape. She was elongated, more so than before. My voice shook as I spoke, trying to calm her. "We'll fix this," I held out my hand. For a moment, I thought she might hold out her own. Maybe she would have if the sirens weren't so loud. An ambulance at the front of the house caught her attention as she let go of the tree, her snake-like limbs falling to the ground as she made her way over the fence. They never caught her. We never found her. Her funeral was held a month later. It's been 3 years. I still live in the same home. Her bedroom is almost exactly as it was. We keep her door open. Sometimes as I walk past, I imagine her, sat in her bed. Her body is back to its regular self. "I'm okay now," she'll say. "You helped me." But it's a mirage, a trick of the mind. My sister as herself is no longer real. Is she still out there, stretched? I got my answer last night. Unable to sleep, I slowly became acutely aware of a tapping noise. I don't know how long it had been going before my mind allowed it to be perceived. Seconds, minutes, hours. I suppose it doesn't matter. Once I had heard it, it stayed. 5 taps, rhythmically pattering against my window, behind the curtain. Sick of the noise, I got up, ready to see tree branches blowing in the wind. Instead, I saw 5 long fingers extending from below my vision. The palm of the hand seemed just on the edge of what I could see. A face, beginning halfway up the window and continuing far below, looked in at me. The eyes were long, with the open mouth being even longer. This was unmistakably my sister's face. Whether or not it's my sister is another question. I stood there for a moment, recoiling, but not making a sound. Her appearance is not what scared me the most. My hand began to tingle. It started with an innocent enough warning from the old man next door. He was a reclusive figure, always dressed in faded flannel and worn-out boots, with gray stubble that covered most of his face like a second layer of skin. Nobody in the neighborhood ever spoke to him much, but when he saw me locking my door one evening, he shuffled over with a strange urgency in his eyes. "You live alone now, don't you?" His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken to another human in days. "Yeah," I replied, a bit uneasy but polite. "Why?" He leaned in close, his breath hot with the scent of whiskey. "You better count your windows twice every night before bed," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Make sure they're all closed, all locked. If you don't, well, let's just say it ain't good." I chuckled awkwardly, unsure if he was joking or just drunk. "Sure, I'll do that." The old man's expression didn't change. "I'm serious, kid. Count them. Twice, or they'll come in." I watched as he shuffled back to his house, a creeping unease settling in my gut. "They'll come in." What did that even mean? But I shook it off as the ramblings of a lonely old man with a little too much time and liquor on his hands. That night, as I wandered around my house before bed, I found myself thinking about his strange warning. I stood in front of the first window in my bedroom and closed it tightly, then the one in the kitchen. After a second of hesitation, I moved through the house, checking each window carefully, just as he had suggested. One in the bathroom, two in the living room, each of them shut and locked. When I reached the last one in the hallway, I counted again in my head. 5 windows, all sealed. It felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. Twice, just like he'd said. Nothing happened that night, of course. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I noticed subtle things. A draft even though the windows were closed, strange sounds late at night, and most unsettling, a growing sense of being watched. The next week, I came home late from work, exhausted, and forgot about the old man's warning. I went straight to bed, my body too heavy with fatigue to bother checking the windows. I didn't even think about it until the middle of the night, when I woke to a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was rain, but the night was dry. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. My heart began to race as I sat up in bed, listening. It was coming from the hallway window, the last one I'd always check. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but curiosity pulled me out of bed. As I approached the hallway, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. The window was closed. Of course it was. But as I reached for the lock, I saw it. A handprint on the glass. Not mine. Something else. Something that shouldn't be there. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The handprint was too large, too distorted. It pressed against the glass from the outside, as though something had been watching me. Frantic, I ran through the house, checking every window, counting them twice, just like the old man had warned. But the windows were all closed, all locked. Yet the feeling that something was wrong persisted, stronger than ever. The next night, I made sure to check the windows before bed, counting each one meticulously. 5 windows. Twice. Then I slept. But the tapping came again, this time louder, faster. It wasn't just one window either. It was all of them. A frantic, rhythmic tapping from every room surrounding me. I leapt out of bed, my body trembling with fear. The windows, they were all shut, yet the tapping wouldn't stop. I backed into the center of the living room, cold sweat trickling down my spine. And that's when I saw it, the shadow moving just outside the glass. A figure, tall and lanky, with impossibly long limbs and a face that seemed to shift and warp under the dim moonlight. It pressed against the window, its grotesque face turning slowly toward me. Eyes, if you could call them that, met mine, hollow and hungry. The tapping stopped, but the window began to creak. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, but eventually the figure melted back into the darkness, leaving me shaken and breathless. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I rushed to the old man's house, desperate for answers. But when I knocked, there was no response. The neighbor told me he'd passed away 3 days ago, right around the time the tapping started. Now I count my windows twice every night. I don't forget anymore, because I know they're still out there, waiting. And if I slip up again, they'll come in.